Now that you have printed or downloaded a copy of the TATE, the Technical Adequacy Tool for Evaluation, and previewed it, I am going to share a few important components about the TATE so that you could potentially utilize it to improve practices for FBAs or behavior intervention plans within your building or district. The purpose of the TATE. When the TATE was originally developed, it was to be a very friendly tool for district educators, staff on an FBA team to evaluate their FBA and behavior intervention plans. It was not intended to evaluate how effective they were at changing behavior, but instead, it was created to determine if the FBA process itself was adequate. The TATE can determine the technical adequacy of the FBA process and establish baseline data for a district, school, or individual. This is really important when we consider school improvement, district action planning, professional development plans, because if we know where the school or district starts, it's a lot easier to determine what we need to do to push them forward and then make sure that the resources, time, money, people that we're putting into place are having an impact. It also will provide information to generate, again, that baseline data to guide district action planning and professional development, making sure that we're using our resources where they're needed the most. As the TATE was developed, it began with a review of literature to identify essential components for adequate FBAs or behavior intervention plans. Then they developed 24 items that were kind of key pieces or components within an FBA. This was later edited down to 20 items. The items that were created were sent to national experts to review. And then a rubric was developed to provide scoring guidelines for each of those 20 items. And the scores range from 0 to 2, 0 being not present or in place at all, 1 being partially in place, and 2 being fully in place. And this is very similar to if you've done any sort of PBIS fidelity tool, a tiered fidelity inventory. Those are the similar types of score ranges and rubric that you would see. The reason why teams felt it was so critical to have a tool to use to make sure that our FBA process was adequate was because there was patterns that were noticed in research of limited input from teachers or others, so only one person giving input on the student. Target behaviors were not necessarily adequately defined, so the FBA became way too broad. Maybe a flawed hypothesis within the FBA. Behavior intervention strategies within the behavior intervention plan not connected back to that hypothesis statement, either because it was flawed from the start or not in the mind of the team as they were developing the intervention plan. And then no process or thought about following through on next steps. How do we make sure that this is the correct plan for the student that we are supporting? So when the tool was developed, the results then from that research had a really high inter-rater reliability score. And an inter-rater reliability score in the 90s, again, would be considered high. And this means that when you have two people independently scoring the same FBA behavior intervention plan using a TATE tool, their total scores would be very, very similar. So that's a good thing. When we have consistent scoring, that means that we're really hitting the nail on the head as far as knowing what is a good thing to have within this process, and we're good at recognizing when it's there or not there. There was also some association to other reliable tools, such as the Behavior Support Plan Quality Evaluation, known as the BSPQE. This is a tool that had been utilized previously. Teams were very familiar with it. It did have some drawbacks, such as it was more form dependent and didn't really address the behavior intervention plan as much. So it collected good information about the student, but didn't necessarily put into action what could be done after we collected that information. So that was a good thing that we saw some association to a reliable tool, but this one did address the behavior intervention plan more. Essential components listed in the TATE. So these are going to be those line items in the TATE that will be scored for whichever FBA or behavior intervention plan that you are looking at the moment. So, number one is input obtained from multiple sources, making sure that you're not just asking one teacher or one source for feedback on a student. Two, problem behavior that is the focus of the FBA, which is identified and defined in that measurable term. So, making sure you really operationalize the definition of the behavior. Three, baseline data is provided on the identified problem behavior. This is so important because if we don't know where the student started, it's hard to tell if what we're doing is working to see growth while we progress monitor. Four, setting events are considered and identified if there's a predictability in the pattern of a certain setting event. They might not always be there, but that we considered it. Five, antecedent events triggering problem behavior are identified and then described accurately. Antecedent events present when no problem behavior occurs are identified and described adequately. So this is interesting because not only are we going to describe the antecedents when the behavior does occur, but when we see those same antecedents happen and then the behavior doesn't occur, we're making note of that too. Because if a student is triggered typically by being asked to complete an academic task independently, and 7 out of 10 times they will have a behavior when asked to do an independent task that it's academic in nature. We also need to take note of those other 3 times. What's going on where the student doesn't have a behavior after that antecedent event? Maybe there's something we can learn from that. We can look at patterns, we can look at the type of request that was made, who was making the request, the tone, the amount of scaffolding or support. There's so many things we could look at to try to figure out what exactly is going on that's making the student react differently in those instances. 7, responses made by others following the problem behavior identified, that consequence, that feedback and reinforcement of the behavior. 8, a hypothesis statement is written and uses the information from the FBA. We're not just guessing, we've got the data to back it up. And 9, function in the hypothesis as valid. So we're focusing in on escape, avoid, or delay, access, or obtain. There are additional components listed in the TATE, but these are more specific to the BIP process that comes after the FBA has been completed. So those are not listed in here, but when you print, you will notice that the second section is very heavily discussing the behavior intervention plan, process, writing, and evaluation.